Our topic tonight is actually the founding of Georgia. I suppose I should have changed the colonial to founding. We're going to go up basically to when Oglethorpe went back to England and washed its hands of Georgia forever and never came back. I'll talk a little bit about the British rule, but in general we're going to stop when we get to the end of Oglethorpe's reign. The book tonight's topic is called Colonial Georgia, 1733 to 1800. That's Oglethorpe there, and there's a bunch of those in the back table. If you find the topic tonight so engrossing and you want to take it home with you, you can. The book's back there. So what are we going to talk about tonight? We're going to talk about how Georgia was founded and why under Oglethorpe. We're going to talk about the War of Jenkins Ear, which was a sarcastic title that Thomas Carlyle gave Oglethorpe's invasion of Florida because this colonial sea captain got his ear cut off by the British, and then 5 years later we invaded Florida, so Thomas Carlyle called it the War of Jenkins Ear. And then we're going to talk about the Methodists and the Lutherans and the Scottish Presbyterians coming to Georgia. Now there's a reason we're going to talk about that. Now I'm going to say something controversial right here up front. But if you recall, Oglethorpe's original idea for the Georgia colony was to bring people who had been in debtor's prison and that sort of thing over here. The poor, the dispossessed. And he did do that. And they all settled in Savannah. And he sat back and waited for the colony to expand. And nothing much happened. Then he invited the Methodists to come from Europe. And then they were very industrious and they started growing crops and the economy grew. Then he invited the Lutherans from Salzburg to come to Georgia. And they too were very entrepreneurial and the economy grew. And then he invited the Scottish Presbyterians to come, and the same thing happened there. So I know this is a horrifying thing to say, but it's just possible that different types of people can have a different impact on the economy of a colony, as was the case here. And we'll talk about more of that as we move along. But that's probably the most controversial thing I'm going to say tonight, so now you've already heard it. I had to put something in here about DeSoto, just so you didn't think I'd forgot him. Yes, he went through Georgia once. End of our discussion of DeSoto. The reason we're not talking about him is because he just passed through. He didn't really form a colony here. So we're going to start with June 9th, 1732, when James Oglethorpe and his associates are granted a royal charter for the province of Georgia. And it was from the Savannah River to the Altamaha River. So it's basically the coastal area up to Augusta. November 17th, 1732, Oglethorpe and 14 followers headed to Georgia on the ship Anne. And February 1st, 1733, they landed and settled near what would become Savannah, Georgia. So that's the beginning of the colony. So you notice he did have to get a royal charter, and he did have some money behind him because it was a group of associates, and they all put up money. So while it's true that Oglethorpe's original plan for the colony was kind of altruistic, debtor's prison, all that kind of stuff, in order to get the whole thing actually running, somebody had to put up some money for it, and so they were hoping a colony would eventually produce crops and that sort of thing. This is what Savannah looked like on March 1734. It looks a little different today if you've been there. I think the coolest part is the fact that it's totally surrounded by trees. And you can see after a year of being there, they've only completed part of the town. Now, you'll notice also immediately the way the town is laid out. It is not laid out the way Atlanta is laid out. In Atlanta, it's impossible to go around a block. If you go around a block, you end up in Pittsburgh. But you'll notice in Savannah, everything is laid out on a nice grid, and you could actually go around a block. So Savannah is well laid out, I think we can say. Still very early, February 1733, Oglethorpe negotiates the purchase of land with the Yamacraw tribe and their chief Tomochichi. We hear his name come up from time to time. There's a Daughters of the American Revolution, a group up in northern Georgia with that name. And here's Tamachichi and his nephew, who actually went over to England with Oglethorpe and were presented to the king. Now, by 1735, Oglethorpe was a pretty strict guy, and he outlawed rum, slaves, Catholics, and trading west of the Savannah River without a license. So at the beginning, when everybody was real wide-eyed and exciting to experiment, all that was okay. Everybody agreed with that. But as time wore on, we can't have rum? What if we want to trade west of the Savannah River? What if we want to trade with the Indians? And eventually, and I'm jumping ahead here, I'm giving you the lead at the beginning, eventually all of these strictures fell away. It broke his heart, broke Oglethorpe's heart, and that's when he finally left and he never came back. 1735, Oglethorpe founded Frederica on St. Simon's Island and Augusta. So within 2 years after he lands, you have 3 cities of some size. You've got Augusta, you have Frederica, and you have Savannah. So all that came fairly quickly. Things were so good between the settlers and the local Indians that on March 26, 1735, the Indians encamped near Frederica, probably Tamachichi, though we don't know that for sure, performed a war dance for the colonists. Now you might think, well, a war dance, maybe they were trying to tell them something. No, they were just trying to do a native dance as entertainment for the colonists. June 14, 1736, Oglethorpe founds Augusta. He orders that it be laid out on the same plan as Savannah. So in Augusta, it's also possible to go around the block, unlike Atlanta. Now, some of you may think of Oglethorpe primarily as a military officer. So where did that come from? 1737, he's commissioned as a colonel in the British Army, and he's given a regiment for defensive purpose in Georgia. Why did he need a regiment of British regulars to come over and help him out here in Georgia? Well, there were 2 reasons. One was you got past the coastal areas, and what was to the west? It wasn't dragons, it was the Creek Indian Nation and the Cherokee Indian Nation. So there was always a possibility of attacks from there. But the real reason is there were rumblings of an invasion from Spanish Florida. Matter of fact, there were always rumblings of an invasion from Spanish Florida, and he was given an army, basically. 1739, Oglethorpe visited Augusta for the only time. He spent most of his time in Frederica and Savannah. Here's the war dance that was performed for the early settlers for their entertainment. Okay, let's talk for a moment. Why was Georgia established? I hear sometimes people say it was supposed to be a prison colony or a penal colony. That's going way, way too far. He petitioned to form the trustees for the establishment of the colony of Georgia in America to allow a place for ex-prisoners and the deserving poor to go to. So in modern terms, we would say he was probably a liberal-minded man. He wanted to do something for the poor and the dispossessed in society. And as I alluded to earlier, this might have been a great idea from a humanitarian viewpoint, but it turned into an economic disaster because after a few years, Savannah was not self-sufficient. So he brought in more industrious groups. The Lutherans, the Presbyterians, the Methodists were soon asked to join the colony, and they did. Okay, the War of Jenkins Ear. So 1731, a Spanish force boards the British ship Rebecca off the coast of Florida and accuses the captain, Robert Jenkins, of being a pirate. They cut off his ear. Historian Thomas Carlyle coined the coming war as the War of Jenkins Ear because he couldn't really think of any other legitimate reason why the war was even fought, so he figured it was all fought over Jenkins' ear. They did not move too quickly to declare war, though, because you notice that happened in 1731. It wasn't until 1739 that Britain declared war on Spain. But we're missing 1734, Oglethorpe begins building military fortifications on St. Simon's Island. The biggest, of course, is Fort Frederica. So October 30th, 1739, Britain declares war on Spain. A lot of the fighting takes place in the Caribbean. It's not shocking that some of it's going to spill over into Florida and Georgia. This is the barracks at Fort Frederica. There's not a whole lot left there, but some of the more substantial buildings are still standing. By the way, here's a good quiz for a historical society. What future president took over Florida and made it part of the United States? Andrew Jackson. So whether you like Andrew Jackson or not, if you like going to Florida, thank Andrew Jackson, because he's the guy that did it. But not during the War of Jenkins Ear. Another picture on Fort Frederica. Okay, January 1740. Notice this is 9 years after poor Captain Jenkins had his ear cut off. Oglethorpe begins raiding forts west of St. Augustine in Florida. Now my British friends will tell me it's Augusta. You should pronounce it Augusta. I've never heard anybody in Florida pronounce it that way, so I'm going to call it St. Augustine. May 1740, Oglethorpe captures Fort San Diego, Fort Picolata, and Fort Mose, 2 miles north of St. Augustine. In June and July of 1740, siege of St. Augustine by General James Oglethorpe, who is now a general, and you'll notice he's invaded Florida by now because he's besieging St. Augustine. He bombards the fort for 27 days. The fort doesn't surrender. Oglethorpe goes away again. That's putting the War of Jenkins Ear kind of in a capsule. June 26, a couple days later, 300 Spanish and free blacks take back Fort Mose. July 20th, Oglethorpe abandons the siege and retreats, leaving his artillery and leaving Florida to the Spanish. So he was not successful in his invasion of Spanish Florida. Here's a wonderful 1742 drawing of the St. Augustine Fort. Isn't that fantastic? Have any of you been to the fort there? I see several hands. I mean, it's still pretty impressive today, but wonderful, wonderful picture, and I appreciate they did it in color for us. Okay, so that was Oglethorpe's invasion of Florida, which didn't go real well, but it is where he made his reputation as a general, which he kept for the rest of his life. Eventually he was brought up to the level of major general when he got back to England, and it was all because of that invasion. But now it's the Spanish forces' turn to invade Georgia, which they did. July 5th, 1742, Don Manuel de Montiano, Spanish governor of Florida, landed 1,900 troops on the south end of St. Simon's Island. Oglethorpe had a small fort there, but when he saw the size of the invasion force, he retreated north. Now, probably at this point, Don Manuel de Montiano had no idea that Fort Frederica was at the other end of the island. He just saw this little fort, they landed, they took it over, and he thought, ooh, for our side. Didn't realize what he was going to be running into. July 7th, 2 days later, at 9 a.m. is the Battle of Gully Hole. A Spanish reconnaissance force runs into Highland Independent Company, Scottish, and a group of Georgia Rangers about 1.5 miles south of Fort Frederica. They're driven back, taking 36 casualties. Oglethorpe personally leads the assault, so he was involved in that. But that's only the first battle that day. So here's where the Spanish land here, and they start going along this military roll, and they probably got within sight of Fort Frederica when they were attacked and had to retreat. So the second battle happens here at Bloody Marsh, back to where they, close to where they landed. Oglethorpe's forces pursued a retreating Spanish, eventually ambushed a larger Spanish force that had stopped for dinner. Spanish losses were around 250 for the British forces. Oglethorpe himself arrived after the fighting was over. July 13th, a Spanish retreat from St. Simon's Island occurs. So Oglethorpe invaded Florida and retreated. Spain invaded Georgia from Florida and retreated. That was pretty much the War of Jenkins Ear, at least as far as it stood in the colonies. 1748, the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle ends the War of Jenkins Ear and sieged Georgia to Britain, where it would remain until 1776. Okay, back to Georgia as a colony. 1741, the trustees, so remember the guys that have the power are the money guys back in England. It's not the people on the ground over here, it's the money guys in England. The trustees create two Georgia counties, Savannah and Frederica. Now this is when Oglethorpe starts getting ticked off. They've been going along for a good 10 years with no spirits, no elixirs of the devil, as they used to call gin. Totally dry colony, Georgia. And 1742, the trustees removed the prohibition on rum. Oglethorpe was not amused. A year later, he returned to England. He never returned to Georgia. The colony did continue to grow, though. 1748, in the course of this year, 7 or 8 vessels laden with Georgia produce sailed from Savannah. Among this number was a ship of 400 tons burthen. So they were starting to ship out some goods. So there was a possibility that this colony thing might actually work out, but Oglethorpe is done. And then, even worse to Oglethorpe than the rum being brought back is January 1st, 1751, slavery is made legal. So Georgia was a free colony until 1751. The slave colony in Georgia grew from 500 to around 18,000 in the next 25 years. January 14, 1751, 16 delegates met in Savannah, elected Francis Harris as Speaker. This is the first assembly of Georgia. Now, of course, they were operating under the rule of the king, but it was some degree of local control. June 10, 1752, the trustees resigned their charter, which is a way of saying we're not making enough money in Georgia, we're giving it up. Here, king, here's your charter back. Feel free to give it to somebody else. 3 days later, final meeting of the trustees. Shortly after, the Earl of Halifax, president of the Board of Trade, takes an interest in Georgia, and it soon becomes a royal colony with a royal governor.
Robert, could you back up a slide there? Back up one more. What is that? 400 tons of what?
Oh, that the ship was burdened with 400 tons of goods.
Burden? Oh, I thought that was some kind of product that they had.
I
never heard of that kind of product.
It's almost Chaucer English, burthened.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I didn't need it.
So Methodists come to Georgia. And how many Methodists do we have in the room? Any? Oh, we've got quite a few. Well, you'll enjoy this section. October 14, 1735, John and Charles Wesley sail for Georgia on the Simmons from Kent. Now, we should point out that at this point, they're not really Methodists. They are priests in the Episcopal Church in England. And they're sent over here by the Episcopal Church to do good among the Indians. So they come over here. 1735, Charles is appointed Secretary of Indian Affairs, and John preaches in Savannah. I was a Methodist myself for a while, so I'm not saying this to be nasty about the Methodists, but neither one was really successful in their appointed role. Here's why. March 9th, 1736, Charles becomes chaplain to the town and the garrison at Frederica. He is not well accepted. Frederica is really a frontier town at that point, and people kind of got used to doing what they like to do. And Charles Wesley, out of the two of them, is probably the most strict of the two brothers, and he was not popular. So he gets out a year later, bearing dispatches for the trustees, and he never comes back to Georgia. So he was only here for a year, and I don't know if he ever met an Indian. Two wonderful stained glass window showing Charles and John Wesley. Okay, let's get into the gossip now.
Where are those stained glass windows?
These are in Atlanta at Grace United Methodist Church off of Ponce de Leon in Atlanta, Georgia. And they're all the way in the front of the church, which means if you go in the church, you have to go all the way to the back because they don't open the front doors. Does that make sense? Good, good. Okay, so let's get into the gossip. Starting in 1737, John Wesley, who's still a young man at this point, remember, he's still around in 1786 when he becomes a bishop of the Methodist Church. He's a young man. He gets a crush on a girl named Sophia Williamson, or actually her maiden name was Hopkey. Well, John was a little tongue-tied, and he didn't quite know what to say to her, and he was horrified when some other guy asked her to marry him, and she said yes. And he was never able to get his proposal out of his mouth. Well, if you were in John's situation, how happy would you be? Well, he did some unfortunate things at this point regarding his role as the parish priest. He denied her communion. And he had no good reason to deny her communion. August 9, 1737, John is served with a warrant for not serving Sophia communion. Now, how could that possibly happen? Because her father was the local magistrate. So if you're going to do something like this against some woman you're interested in, don't do it, or for her father's the head judge in the area. September 1st, 1737, 10 bills against Wesley are presented to the grand jury, charging that John Wesley, clerk, had broken the laws of the realm, contrary to the peace of our sovereign Lord the King, his crown and dignity. Whoa, that sounds like pretty serious stuff, when all it was a spat over the fact that he got jealous because his old girlfriend married somebody else. This was all hogwash, by the way. Whether or not he should have given her communion, that aside, as the parish priest, he could decide that. That was within his purview to decide. So December 2nd, 1737, with the law literally nipping at his heels, Wesley shook the dust off my feet, and he left Georgia. Again, like his brother, never to return. On the ship home, he supposedly wrote, "They sent me to Georgia to convert the Indians, and when, Lord, are they going to convert me?" So he was not very happy with his experience in Georgia. Now, some of you may say, well, where did you get all that information from? How do you know all that gossip? The reason we know all the gossip is he wrote it all carefully in his own journal. Everything I just said there is in John Wesley's journal from his time in Georgia. And you can look it up on the web. I left a lot of stuff out that's pretty cool, actually. On the more positive side, evangelist George Whitfield arrived in Georgia in 1738, and he built an orphanage for boys 10 miles south of Atlanta. That's what it used to look like. The orphanage still exists today, but it's not in that building. Now, he would go on to become the most famous preacher of the 18th century, and he preached all the way up and down the coastline in the original 13 colonies. If you ever heard of the Great Awakening, he didn't start the Great Awakening, but he's the one who spread it up and down the coastline.
Is that building still there?
No, that building's gone, but the orphanage still exists.
Under what name?
I think it's still the Bethesda orphanage for boys.
In Savannah?
Yeah. Here's the wonderful monument to the Wesleys at Fort Pulaski. If you've been to Fort Pulaski, you got to walk down basically into the swamp behind the fort, and you'll find this wonderful, wonderful monument. And there's George Whitfield preaching. He preached something like 20,000 sermons, most of them outdoors. Okay, the Lutherans come to Georgia. Okay, I got called down on my nomenclature here the last time I gave this presentation, so I'm going to explain myself up front. Now, I called them German Lutherans, and a woman pointed out Salzburg's not in Germany, it's in Austria. Well, the reason I could be a little sloppy is because neither one existed back then. Germany didn't exist, Austria didn't exist, it was all part of the Holy Roman Empire, but they spoke German in both places, so that's why I called them German Lutherans. So, the Salzburgers set sail for Georgia also. They were going to be asked by Oglethorpe to come to the Georgia colony. They reached the Savannah River in 1734, and the original site of the town they settled is chosen by James Oglethorpe himself. Now, the problem is the site that he picked was in a swamp. So they didn't like that site, so they asked him to change it. So the Salzburgers, they start arriving, they begin building shelters, they observe a day of Thanksgiving, etc. By February 5th, 1736, the population of Ebenezer is now 200 plus. Now that church that we had a picture of on the cover of the book is the church they built. So by 1736, the inhabitants of Ebenezer realized that they had built their town in the middle of a swamp, and they went to Oglethorpe and said, could you give us another place to build the town, because this one didn't work out. So Oglethorpe goes to the town on a fact-fighting mission. June 1738, Salzburgers inhabit New Ebenezer, which is the site you can go to today, leaving the original site as a cow pen. That's all they thought it was worth, was a place to store their cattle, which is what they did. Now they start experimenting with raising cotton. So if somebody ever says to you in a bar, you know, it's trivia night at the bar, and they say, who grew the first cotton in Georgia? Your answer will be the Lutherans, or the Salzburgers at New Ebenezer. Also, in a letter to Oglethorpe, the Salzburgers claim to have had success with a rice crop. So they were also the first group to have a rice business in Georgia. By 1741, 1,200 German Protestants have come to Georgia. And another big one, December 4, 1742, Oglethorpe sends 500 mulberry trees to Ebenezer because he wants to see if they can produce silk, which they could make a lot of money from if they could. You can see, this is New Ebenezer. You can see it too is laid out so you can actually go around the block. Very rectangles and squares and that sort of thing. And this is the Savannah River here. And then this is the Ebenezer Creek. And you said it was okay to throw something else in, so I'll throw something else in here. I'm jumping ahead to the Civil War. Union General Jefferson Davis. Isn't that a great name for a Union General? So Union General Jefferson Davis had taken Ebenezer, and he's continuing towards Savannah. Well, he's got about 2,000 freed slaves who are following along behind him. He didn't want them following along behind him. So he got his men to cross Ebenezer Creek, and then they started getting on flatboats. And when the flatboats got out to the middle of the creek, he cut the lines, and the flatboats sailed down to the Savannah River. So that was how he dealt with the problem of having the hangers on. The first Jerusalem church is dedicated in 1744. 1750, 74 pounds, 2 ounces of raw silk is produced at Ebenezer. They erect a fort in 1757. 1764, 8,600 pounds of silk, half the colony's output. And then the original pastor finally dies in 1765. So you can see, just like the Methodists, they too were very industrious. And in 1769, they built the Ebenezer Church, or the New Jerusalem Church, and this is still there today. Now, if you go to New Ebenezer today, there's a graveyard, and there's the church. And the town is completely gone now. But the church is still there after all these years. And finally, we get to the Presbyterians who came to Georgia. 1735, Oglethorpe sends representatives to Scotland to recruit settlers for New Inverness, Georgia. 1736, a group of Scottish Highlanders found Darien on the Altamaha River, bringing Presbyterianism to Georgia, also bringing Calvinism and a sense of industry and a Protestant work ethic and all that stuff. March 1736, the Highlanders helped build Fort St. Andrews on Cumberland Island and Fort St. George on the St. Johns River, and they began working on Fort Frederica. 1737, the Highlanders formed the Highland Independent Company, later known as Oglethorpe's Regiment of Foot, and the Highland Rangers. They are a key part of his invasion of Florida. They are also a key part of the defeat of the Spanish when they invaded St. Simon's Island. And they continue to arrive in Darien. 1739, a petition against slavery is signed by 18 members of the Darien colony. Talked about the invasion of Florida. More of them continued to arrive. 1767, Laughlin McIntosh surveys Darien. Not too many years later, he will get into a duel with the highest ranking political official in Georgia during the Revolutionary War. And that official's name is Button Gwinnett, and Laughlin McIntosh shoots him dead. So if you're in the middle of a revolution, that's something you probably don't want to do, is to have the head of your militia shoot your head politician. That's probably not something you want to have. But he surveyed Darien after it had already been built. This is Oyster Shell Road. The ridge shows old Tabby Ruins of abandoned buildings. Unfortunately, these are gone. But back then, if you look at the building supplies they had down in that area, well, there was lots of sand and there was lots of seashells. So they figured out a way to crush the seashells and mix it with the sand, and they were able to build these wonderful tabby buildings. But they're pretty much gone today. This is Oglethorpe visiting the Highlanders in 1736 down in Darien. So the Royal Colony happens between 1752 and 1783. Remember, Oglethorpe leaves the colony like 1742, never comes back. The royal governors give up a few years after that. So it becomes a royal colony directly under the king. And to be fair to the British administrators, the economy grew, new parishes were created. They didn't do a bad job of running the colony. However, there's increasing tension in Georgia as the Revolutionary War drew near. There was also treaties and tension with the Creeks and the Cherokees. They created some new parishes. They acquired some land from the Indians, and they created Christchurch, St. Matthew's, St. George's, St. Paul's, St. Philip's, St. John's, St. Andrew's, and St. James's parishes. And October 10, 1763, King George III annexed all land between the Altamaha River and St. Mary's to Georgia, creating 4 new parishes: St. David, St. Patrick, St. Thomas, and St. Mary. So you see the colony is really starting to grow and expand now. And I will end it here just to point out that even by 1777, even by the time of the Revolution, the Georgia colonies goes from Augusta up here down, here's the Altamaha River, but it really goes past that all the way down to here. So this is the colony of Georgia. Now where we are right now is the Creek Indian Nation. There was no Macon, there was no Thomaston, there was certainly no Columbus. Where I came from earlier today was part of the Cherokee Nation up here. So just keep that in mind when we talk about 18th century Georgia. Really just talking about this slip of land over here on the coast of the Atlantic, and then going up the Savannah River. So I think that's it. I'll leave you with one thought. Please buy my books. Thank you.
Give you one of our hats, since you've got to be president up there, and then you can be whatever you want to here.
Member at large. How about that?
Okay. Okay. That covers everything that we were going to talk about tonight. We'll have to bring him back for an addition and carry on with the state of Georgia at a later time. Glad to see all of y'all and thank you for coming.